Well, good afternoon and welcome. It's my enormous pleasure to welcome you to what I believe is the eighth annual fall meeting of the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology. And this is a work of love that has been supported by a web of people over the years. And it's really wonderful to see people in person to come out and to join in this conversation together. I'm going to take the time just to tell a little bit about the society itself. Not everybody here will be very familiar with the society, and to introduce the members of the steering committee that are here. So the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology exists in order to promote research and discussion that advances post-supersessionist thought. The Society understands post-supersessionism as a family of theological perspectives that affirms God's irrevocable covenant with the Jewish people as a central and coherent part of ecclesial teaching. It seeks to overcome understandings of the new covenant that entail the abrogation or obsolescence of God's covenant with the Jewish people, of the Torah as a demarcator of Jewish communal identity, or of the Jewish people themselves. The Society welcomes participation from all who seek to advance post-supersessionist theology. It especially seeks to promote, not exclusively, especially, perspectives that remain faithful to core Christological convictions, that affirm the ecclesia's identity as a table fellowship of Jews and Gentiles united in the Messiah, and that engage with Jewish thought and tradition as an expression of ecclesial partnership with the Jewish people as a whole. So the society, you can find it online, it's not hard to locate, and you can learn about the activities by becoming a member or a friend. And there's really no difference, there's no cost, except this, a member. To be a member, you're saying, I'm happy with the statement I just read. If you're a friend, it means, I'm not entirely happy with the statement you just read, but I'd still like to know about what you're up to. And here's a policy we've adopted and adhered to over the years. If you become a member or a friend, you will hear about us only about society business. So that's that means you will not get a lot of emails from us. And it means that a lot of wonderful opportunities that we know of, we're not going to share with you because we know your inboxes are already full. And so that's a policy decision we may revisit in the future and try to find a way of working. But please do consider becoming a member. So it's really terrific to have you, and I'm so delighted to have a wonderful panel with us today. Edwin Van Driel, Collin Cornell, and Rabbi Brill are here today to engage in a conversation about doing post-supersessionist theology today. So what does it look like? What is the beast? Neither Collin nor Edwin, and I don't mean to put words in the mouth, I think would identify themselves as primarily or principally a post-supersessionist theology. But in the work they currently do, it is a concern that they integrate into the rest of their work. And we are eager to hear from them. We're delighted to have Brill as a respondent. I'm going to introduce, did I say who I was? I don't think I did. My name's Kendall Soulen, and I have the privilege of directing the society. So I'm Kendall Soulen, and I'm going to introduce our speakers in a little bit more detail as they come up to arise. And our first speaker is going to be Collin Cornell, and he'll give us the title of his paper in a moment. But before I do that, give me a moment to have the members of the steering committee stand up so you can be recognized and just say greetings and thank you. And it's wonderful to have the help of these people. So, yes. So we're going to go in this order. Here's our order of business. Collin Cornell is going to present his paper. Edwin Driel is going to present, and then Alan Brill will respond, and we'll have a time for conversation. Collin Cornell is assistant professor at Fuller Theological Seminary, where he is dually appointed in Bible and missiology. Dr. Cornell earned his PhD from Emory University, and his interests include biblical theology, theology of mission, as well as race, colonialism, and ecology. Cambridge University Press has published 2 of Dr. Cornell's monographs, including Monotheism and Divine Aggression. And he is also the co-translator from the Dutch of Cornelis Haykom and Miskote's Biblical ABCs, the Basics of Christian Resistance. Dr. Cornell's most recent book, which came out very recently indeed, and I neglected to bring the copy I have by my chair in my office, is entitled God Draws Near, Rethinking the Biblical Theology of Mission. So, Collin, welcome. Oh, wonderful. And so those of you who want to see the books, they're up here, and you can come up and browse. And there it is. Nope, that's not the one. There it is. So please come up after our talk, and you can take a look at all 3 of our presenters' most recent books. Collin, table is yours.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much to Kendall and the Society for the invitation. I was remembering that I was actually present at, I think, the inaugural meeting of the Society, 2018, but never yet have presented. So it's a real honor to be here this afternoon. I'll also say that the content of this paper is just a sampling, really a dusting from the book itself, and also in some regards presses beyond the book itself, since I turned the manuscript in well over a year now and have had some further thoughts since then, and have also digested others' works in the time that remains. So if you really like what you hear here, there's more of that. If you don't, then there's also more that's different from this in the book, either way. So the title of my paper this afternoon is Challenging Israel Obsolescence in Biblical Theology of Mission. The topic of our session, as Kendall just mentioned, is doing post-supersessionist theology. And of course, many approaches fit within that description, many specific tasks. What unites post-supersessionist theology is named in the mission statement just read, the conviction that God's covenant with the Jewish people is irrevocable. Because Christian theology has so frequently promoted or assumed the opposite, namely the revocation or revocability of God's covenant, one frequent task of post-supersessionist theology is diagnostic. Post-supersessionist theology uncovers existing sources of Israel obsolescence within Christian theology. Once duly uncovered, then prognostic possibilities open up. Post-supersessionist theology can assume a more positive or constructive procedure. My paper attends to both of those tasks, the diagnostic and the prescriptive. It uncovers several sources of Israel obsolescence, and it attempts to reinterpret the relevant data in ways that affirm the ongoing validity of God's covenant with the Jewish people. My paper attends to both these 2 tasks within a particular discourse area, specifically biblical theology. I refer by this phrase to a range of modern theological programs that are at once exegetical, meaning concerned with interpreting biblical texts, yet also integrative, in that they seek convergences, commonalities across diverse biblical materials, and finally they are theological, in the sense not only of stockpiling observations about the divine character in the pages of the Bible, but of registering constructive claims on the basis of the Bible about the one whom Christian churches worship. Indeed, the literature I address in this paper belongs to a subgenre within biblical theology. I try to uncover and remedy Israel obsolescence not in biblical theology writ large, but rather within biblical theology of mission. The writing that fits this heading is, like its general counterpart, exegetical, integrative, and theological. It is also characteristically interested in God's pursuit of the nations. Various schemata and foci organize instances of biblical theology, but works of biblical theology of mission almost definitionally foreground themes of expansion, outreach, and centrifuge. They look beyond here toward there. They programmatically prefer the universal to the particular. As such, and relatedly, they frame Israel's vocation in terms of God's more ultimate purpose toward the nations. Within this configuration, Israel already suffers from a certain contingency in relation to God. The literature of biblical theology of mission commonly calls Israel an instrument or channel of God's blessing, which is to say, the final or true destination of God's blessing lies beyond Israel, with the nations. The nations are not imbued with any comparable instrumentality or mediacy. The nations rather usually sit on the preferred side of these structuring polarities. They embody the universal rather than the particular, the ultimate rather than the intermediate, the final rather than the provisional. Following sections indicate the textual sources from out of which biblical theologies of mission develop these polarities. These biblical texts occur at the beginning and the end of the Christian Bible, in Genesis and Revelation respectively. These framing Bible passages set the hermeneutical context within which more specific interpretive performances of Israel obsolescence can function. So I'll engage first with these framing texts. The next section of the paper uncovers Israel obsolescence more directly in biblical texts that serve as charter statements of Israel's vocation, and lastly, in biblical texts that purportedly anticipate an eschatological expansion or redefinition of Israel. So the movement here is from framing texts to charter texts to eschatological expansion texts. At each point along the way, I will challenge the prevailing interpretation within biblical theology of mission, and then the final section will summarize the critiques and offer a constructive counterproposal, according to which Israel is and remains always God's uniquely beloved people. So starting then with the framing texts. At the level of individual biblical texts, many or most examples of biblical theology of mission, especially those written after 1950, lend special privilege hermeneutically to the beginning and the end of the Bible. Genesis and Revelation play an outsized role. And within those books, one scene in Revelation and one set of chapters in Genesis, the so-called primeval history. So it is that in Revelation chapter 7, John sees, quoting, a great multitude that no one could count from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, robed in white with palm branches in their hands. This is where the Bible ends in a lot of biblical theology of mission. At the crescendo of history, the Lamb receives worship from all nations. All the nodes within the binary scaffolding of biblical theology of mission draw potency from here. Universality, ultimacy, finality. So likewise, works in biblical theology of mission that post-date 1950 give special weight to the beginning chapters of the Bible. Following the work of Gerhard von Rad, such writings assert that the first 11 chapters of Genesis spell out a grand declension. A good creation sustains damage that worsens across human generations, starting with the first couple, Adam and Eve, proceeding to their fratricidal son Cain, spreading to further violence before the flood, and reaching a nadir with the hubristic Tower of Babel. Sin mounts to, quote, avalanche proportions. That's verbiage from Gerhard von Rad, but recurs in works published quite recently. Notably, the crisis encompasses the whole of humanity, as shown by the inclusion of the table of nations in Genesis 10. The problem of sin is, in other words, universal. The scope of salvation at the end of the Christian Bible therefore matches the scope of the problem allegedly narrated in its opening chapters. And so that's sort of the framing texts in this biblical theology of mission. Against this interpretation, I observe that the placement of a universal redemption at the end of the Christian Bible does not require that this conclusion constitutes the only or ultimate object of God's work narrated within the long middle of the Bible. In other words, because the story ends here does not entail that all God's purposes reach their end here. In fact, I would urge that the middle of the Bible discloses far more of God's will than its outer frame, and that God's nearness to Israel and God's nearness in Christ, which take place in that middle, are not only redemptive. So I'm disentangling here a conceptual pair that structures biblical theology of mission, binds together the universal and ultimate. I insist instead that God's work in Israel and in Christ are both particular, but not for that reason penultimate. Rather, each represents the culmination of God's purpose. God always meant to draw close to Israel in the tabernacle. And God always meant to draw close to Israel and the nations and all creation in Jesus Christ. To make this claim necessitates a further disentangling. Within existing biblical theology of mission, the Bible tells an exclusively redemption story. God's mission in calling Israel and in enfleshing the Son responds to the crisis of sin. Whatever original or prior purposes God had for creation effectively go on pause until the drama of sin and salvation concludes. In contrast, however, I argue that the divine actions we see in the long middle of the Christian Bible are not only redemptive. Consider, for example, Christ's blessing of the children, or his blessing at his ascension in Luke, or his practice of table fellowship. These actions are not salvific. They answer to a different logic, one oriented to sheer goodwill and desire to keep company. So likewise, the tabernacle texts at the heart of the Pentateuch. This elaborate, mobile sanctuary exists not only to atone for sin, but more basically to enable the fiery personal presence of God to keep company with Israel. So the universal frontispiece in Genesis 1 through 11 already suggests that creation continues even in and through the dynamics of sin and fallenness. A story of ongoing blessing and creation thereby includes and encompasses the redemption story. The first humans disobeyed and suffered judgment, and yet they also advanced in maturity, moving from childlikeness to sexuality, nakedness to being clothed. The pathway they took was tragic, yet surely God meant for them to grow up. Similarly, Cain built the first city. His descendants invented metalworking and music. The pathway they took was violent, but cities and music enact God's will that humans should rule and multiply, as per Genesis 1. Likewise, again, the scattering of humans after Babel represents a judgment on hubris, but the spreading and diversification of humans conforms to God's first will. Sin and grace are nested within a deeper plot line of creation, assuming the rich conditions intended by God's blessing. So that's the framing texts at the outer corners of the Bible. Charter texts. Genesis and Revelation, the beginning and the end. Those are the framing texts. They reinforce the ultimacy of God's purpose toward all nations. They valorize the universal over against the long middle section of the Bible, with its particular focus on Israel. Already this construction subtly demotes and devalues Israel's calling. Israel is precisely not primary, but secondary, not ultimate, but intermediate. Still, the contingency of God's relationship to Israel comes into more direct focus through the interpretation of two charter texts. I'm going to talk more about the one and less about the other. Both of these texts appear within the Pentateuch. They are past-facing, retrospective, and they indicate Israel's divinely given charter or vocation. They modulate between the supposedly universal interest of the Bible's opening chapters and its subsequent long narration of Israel's life with God. These texts enjoy a consensus significance across the post-1950 literature of biblical theology of mission. The first of these charter texts is Genesis 12. Although this passage languished in relative obscurity prior to the 20th century, the The research of Gerhard von Rad catapulted it into the interpretive spotlight. He trailblazed an exegesis such that God's promise to Abram represents, here quoting, the opening words of the story of redemption, and as such, the answer to the problem posed by the early history of the world. Stated otherwise, on von Rad's reading, Genesis 12 pledges a universal solution to a universal plight. It also positions Israel's calling in relation to that grand redemptive project. The first sentences that the Lord addresses to Abram pertain to him and his descendants. The Lord promises greatness, blessing, fame, and protection. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. But then everything hinges on verse 3b, which pans from Abram to all the families of the earth. In most English translations, and most emphatically in Gerhard von Rad's translation, the verse reads, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." The scope of this blessing is comprehensive, corresponding to all the nations involved in the declension of the primeval history. The prepositional phrase, "in you," b'cha, earmarks Abram and his descendants as the mediators of this blessing intended for all nations. The second charter text, I'll say less about it, comes in Exodus 19. Basically, in brief, biblical theology of mission since 1950 has made of Exodus 19 mostly a restatement of Genesis 12. So that is to say, turning it from being something describing Israel's specific unique vocation into a sort of mediatory role vis-a-vis the nations, Israel's calling on behalf of the nations. Against these interpretations, I argue that these charter texts, so we had framing texts, these are the charter texts, modulating from the universal towards the middle particular content in the Bible. I argue that these texts simply do not put Israel in a mediate position, a mediate position in relation to the nations. Their much more obvious purpose is to claim a unique, which is to say ultimate, relationship between the Lord and this particular people. The blessing promised to Abram is enormous. All the families of the earth enter the picture only to illustrate the enormity of his blessedness, not to indicate the actual intended recipients of that blessing. Similarly, in the case of Exodus 19, it mentions all the peoples not to share the real objects of Israel's priestly intermediation, but rather the raw material out of which God called and fashioned this treasured possession. The relevant preposition, min, out of, is partitive. You shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples, not dative. These charter texts do not envision any expiration date or limit condition on the blessing of Abraham and his descendants or the treasured status of Israel. No obsolescence is possible, at least in these charter texts. So, coming here to the section I want to spend relatively more time on, eschatological expansion texts. So because the framing texts in Genesis and Revelation exercise such a decisive hermeneutical role within biblical theology of mission, the charter texts must serve a modulating function. They segue between the nations, which are described in terms of being universal and ultimate, and Israel, which is particular and intermediate, according to the governing default paradigm. This is especially evident at the joint between the first framing text, the primeval history, and the promise to Abram. The eschatological expansion texts serve a similar modulating function within biblical theology of mission, except in relation to Israel and the final framing text of Revelation. If the book of Revelation prophesies the worship of every tribe and nation and tongue, then a number of individual texts from within Israel's prophets segue between Israel's vocation and that final goal. These passages are not past-facing and retrospective, but future-facing and prospective. So also, if the obsolescence of Israel was more or less implicit within the biblical theology of mission interpretation of the charter texts, it comes to a more explicit expression in its characteristic exegesis of the eschatological expansion texts. In the hands of several biblical theologians of mission, these prophetic texts redefine the parameters of Israel so that the entity under this name includes Gentile worshipers of Christ. Indeed, the New Testament scholar Scott McKnight coined an abstract noun to refer exactly to this belief. Here I'm quoting him. I speak of expansionism. That is, the people of God, Israel, expands to include Gentiles on the basis of faith in Jesus the Messiah, end quote. Theologically, the effect of this eschatological expansionism is to blur the terms of God's promises made to Israel, to make other peoples the inheritors of Israel's covenant relationship, even to the extent of transferring, expropriating their very name, Israel. The exegetical pressure generating this move, I think, comes from Romans 11:26, with its assertion that all Israel will be saved. To assuage the apparent extremity of that result, some biblical theological commentators gerrymander its meaning to reflect the current composition of Christian churches, with their mostly Gentile and sparsely Jewish membership. Biblical theologians of mission also seek to read that situation back onto several prophetic texts from, Israel's scriptures. Christopher Wright's classic and also recently revised work, The Mission of God, thus dedicates 6 pages to expositing 3 prophetic texts, Amos 9, Isaiah 44, and Zechariah 2. Amos 9 prophesies the raising up of the booth of David. Once restored, David will then possess their neighboring country Edom, as well as all the nations who are called by my name. Being called by God's name, Wright says, quote, denotes ownership and intimate relationship. It is a great privilege, once reserved to Israel, but now expanded. Rather, and more accurately, here quoting him, this is an eschatological extension of a status that had hitherto been Israel's alone, end quote. In Wright's treatment, the oracles of Isaiah and Zechariah up the ante. Isaiah 44 imagines not just the inscription of the Lord's name onto a non-Israelite, but also the opening up of Israel's own name. The passage reads like this. This one will say, I am the Lord's. Yet another will be called by the name of Jacob. Yet another will write on the hand, the Lord's, and adopt the name of Israel. That's from the NRSV. Zechariah 2 presses yet further. The Lord promises to come and dwell in the midst of daughter Zion. The oracle continues, many nations shall join themselves to the Lord on that day and shall be my people, and I will dwell in your midst. Wright commentates, here quoting at greater length, they, the nations, will enjoy exactly the same covenantal relationship with the Lord that Israel does. The expression, they will be from me a people, is precisely the language of the covenant, with its roots going back to Sinai. And it is covenantal language that hitherto applied only to Israel. Significantly, although the nations are plural, as is the verb they will be, the predicate is singular, a people. This is not Israel plus the nations. He's saying this is not Israel plus the nations, but the nations as Israel. I'm still quoting him. One people belonging to God, end quote. The nations as Israel. In just this way, the intermediate identity of Israel is evacuated, en route to the more ultimate divine purpose of all nations thronging around the throne of the Lamb. The eschatological expansion of Israel feeds into the eschatological outer frame of the Christian Bible. But I observe that this move amounts to a straightforward disinheritance. It raises Israel's obsolescence quite plainly. My most basic objection to this interpretation is it contorts the content of God's promises made to Israel. The whole force of the Apostle Paul's argument in Romans 9 through 11 is to insist that God is faithful and God's word has not failed, in spite of twists and tragedies along the way. If the recipients of the promised salvation are largely different than the promissory, then that is a failing argument. I would also emphasize that the exegesis of those three prophetic texts must sit within the whole arc of Israel's eschatological expectations. Neither Amos, nor Isaiah, nor Zechariah, in fact, envision the evacuation or dissolution of God's people Israel, nor do they envision the wholesale expansion of Israel. To the contrary, the prophets are everywhere concerned to communicate that God will vindicate this people. Occasional texts that speak of Gentiles admiring and learning from Israel, for example, elsewhere in Zechariah, in those days 10 men from nations of every language shall take hold of a Jew, grasping his garment and saying, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. Even of joining Israel. Those prophecies belong within this context. Gentile inclusion, so much as such a thing is even identifiable in the prophets, is a minor phenomenon within a glut of writings about Israel's future. And where it appears, it evokes the overflowing abundance of God's fidelity to this beloved people, rather than any transfer of names or rights. So, coming then to the conclusion and counterproposal. Biblical theology of mission characteristically centers on the nations. It prefers the universal to the particular, associating the first with God's ultimate purpose and the second with God's intermediate purpose. Israel is already shunted to second place. Further interpretations of charter texts, Genesis 12, Exodus 19, render Israel's secondariness an even finer grain, making of them a mediator of God's blessings intended for Gentiles. Israel obsolescence is built in, but implicit. Eschatological expansion texts, on the other hand, ensure that the name Israel itself is parted from its original reference, a more straightforward form of obsolescing. Against all this, I propose that the long, particular middle of the Christian Bible discloses God's ultimate purpose. In order to make this move, I needed to disentangle universal and ultimate. I also needed to reframe the Bible not as a redemption story only, but one of ongoing blessing and creation, with redemption as a subplot. The apex of God's will to bless does not happen in the beginning, but in the middle, specifically in God's tabernacling presence in the midst of the Israelite encampment and in the fleshly presence of God in Jesus Christ. I furthermore sketched interpretations of the charter texts and eschatological expansion texts that foreclose the obsolescence of Israel. God made promises of blessing to Abram out of the same sheer goodwill with which God blessed creation in the beginning. Not in order to make of him a channel or instrument en route to the nations. God treasures Israel from out of the nations and not on behalf of the nations. When the nations join themselves to Israel, that is a participation in Israel's vindication, not their evacuation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Collin. It's now my privilege to introduce Edwin von Driel. Edwin is the Director's Bicentennial Professor of Theology at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He earned a BDiv, MDiv, and MPhil in philosophy from Utrecht University and a PhD in religious studies from Yale University. Von Driel's main theological interests are Christology, ecclesiology, and the interaction between biblical studies and theology. Von Driel is the author of Incarnation Anyway, Arguments for Supralapsarian Christology with Oxford in 2008, and as of this month, The Incarnation as God's First Intention, Supralapsarian Christology for Faith and Practice. And if I'm not mistaken, there's a book discussion later in the weekend on Edwin's book. And I will let Edwin introduce the title of his paper.
Thank you very much, Kendall, and other members of the steering committee for the invitation. The title of my presentation is On Incarnation and Family, Supralapsarian Christological Resources for a Post-Supersessionist Theology. I trust that still doesn't tell you anything. So let's get into it. So like Collin, I think, when I received the invitation, I thought for a moment, so what does it mean to be doing post-supersessionist theology? And I take it that doing post-supersessionist theology has three characteristics, two explicit and one implicit. Explicitly, any kind of post-supersessionist theology affirms the irrevocable nature of God's covenant with Israel, and affirms that this covenant is the expression of a free, gracious, and undeserved election on God's part. Implicitly, I think post-supersessionist theology aims to narrate the overall story of God and that what is not God in such a way that God's covenantal relationship with Israel is an intrinsic part of that canonical story. For a long time, as Kendall in his work has shown, Christian traditions have told the story in such a way that the narrative jumped from creation and fall to incarnation and redemption. Post-supersessionist theologies offer narrative ways in which Israel, as it were, is written back into the story as an essential part of God's relating to that what is not God. Now, how to do this is a matter of dispute, even among post-supersessionist theologies. That is, theologians with post-supersessionist commitments to the free and irrevocable election of Israel, may still differ on what kind of story to tell. And they differ, I believe, particularly in how to answer these three questions. Why is there election rather than not? That is, why does God's relating to that what is not God take the shape of a narrow concentration on a particular people rather than an equal divine engagement of all nations? Secondly, what is the goal of God's election of Israel? What shape does the relationship take that is established by this relationship? And thirdly, how does God's election in Jesus Christ of not just Jews but also Gentiles relate to the reason for and the goal of God's election of the Jewish people? Now, in what follows, I will lay out one particular post-supersessionist way of narrating the canonical story, and thereby one particular, I believe, post-supersessionist way of answering these three questions. And I will do so in 3 steps. My argument is rooted in a particular Christological account, which I will first summarize. I will then draw on this account to secondly give a particular set of post-supersessionist answers to the 3 questions I formulated. And finally, so as to bring out more clearly the nature of my account, I will contrast these answers with a friendly rivalry, post-supersessionist approach. So my proposal regarding Israel's election is embedded in what I call supralapsarian understanding of the incarnation. In the tradition of Christian theology, the majority view holds that the incarnation is infralapsarian, that means is contingent upon sin. God becomes incarnate, according to that narrative, to take care of the sin problem. A minority view in the Christian tradition holds, however, that this is too narrow an understanding of the biblical narrative. And I think Collin's paper, in a way, expressed that also. This view argues that in the incarnation we gain a richness in divine intimacy and creational transformation that cannot be simply explained as a divine countermeasure to sin, but rather that in this event is revealed to us the goal of creation. This is a supralapsarian Christological understanding of creation, that in the ordering of divine intentions, the incarnation is not contingent upon sin, but rather precedes the allowance for sin. So, without further arguing for that, my account of Israel's election is going to assume that supralapsarian Christology is correct. Well, supralapsarian Christology is often presented as an argument about a counterfactual. Would God have become incarnate even if we had not sinned? The way I just phrased things in the previous paragraph do not concern a history and an incarnation that could have been, but a history as it is. That is, my supralapsarian position takes its starting point in the incarnation as we have it, and posits that this gift of divine presence simply cannot be explained as solely contingent upon sin. And it is within this understanding of history and reality that we must give an account of God's election of Israel. Further, my account not only assumes supralapsarian Christology, but it also assumes what I call the absolute priority of Christ. To say that in the ordering of divine intentions the incarnation is not contingent upon sin is not yet to claim that the incarnation is not contingent upon any other divine intentions. That is, there are supralapsarian Christologies that understand the incarnation as still serving a larger goal, even if not the goal of remedying sin. For example, one may say that the incarnation is the supralapsarian means by which God imparts God's self to all humanity. In this line of thought, God's desire to be imparted to humanity is logically prior to the intention to become incarnate. On such an account, the incarnation is thus not contingent upon sin, but also not first in the ordering of divine intentions. Other accounts, though, hold that the incarnate one that the incarnate one has absolute priority over all things. I think the Colossian letter holds such an account. It says in that famous hymn in the first chapter of the letter that the incarnate Christ, the one who is the image of the invisible God, is the one for whom all things have been created. Now think about the logic of that. On such an account, the incarnate one is not contingent upon anything else. The very first thing that God decides is to become incarnate, because it can't be that if God creates for this one all things, that means that God first has to decide to be this one. Now my argument assumes that this understanding of God's intentionality is correct. The very first thing that God decides is to become incarnate. Everything else that God intends is in the context of that first divine intention. Further, my argument also holds that the particular aim of God's decision to become incarnate and to create everything for the incarnate one's sake is fellowship. As the Apostle Paul says in Romans 8, quote, "For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he, the Son, might be the firstborn within a large family." End of quote. The Son of which Paul speaks here is the incarnate Christ, not the non-incarnate second person of the Trinity. After all, the Son is said to be the firstborn, a phrase that does not apply to inner Trinitarian relationships, but to that what is enfleshed. Of this firstborn, Paul says that others are predestined to be conformed to his image so that he might have a large family. Note the supralapsarian logic here. The incarnate one does not exist for the sake of the elect, as is the case on an infralapsarian Christological logic, but the elect exist for the sake of the incarnate one. But also note the goal of all of this, according to Paul, so that he may have a large family. Family formation, community, to be with. That's the goal of creation. That's the goal of incarnation. Finally, my argument assumes that to be a human being, as what we're speaking about in the incarnation, is to be a particular human being. That is, when God becomes incarnate, God does not assume generic humanity, for such a thing does not exist. To be a human being is to be contextual, it is to be located somewhere. To be a human being is to have a particular family, to be part of a particular tribe, to have a particular ethnicity. To be a human being is to find one's roots in a place and to partake in a particular history. All this flows from the fact that a human being is a creature, and creatures by definition are limited and situated, therefore, somewhere. If God is to become human, God therefore becomes a particular human being. Incarnation means that God becomes part of a family, of a tribe, of an ethnicity. It means that God is located in a place and rooted in a history. Now, with these assumptions in hand, let's turn to the question of Israel's election. On the account that I just laid out, the very first thing in the order of divine intentions is to become incarnate. That is, the very first thing that God decides is to be Jesus Christ. All that follows is embedded within this decision. To become Jesus Christ is, however, for God to become part of that what is not God. To become incarnate is therefore a form of divine self-giving. It is, in general, to, as it were, reach outside of God's self, to participate in that what is not God. And it is specifically to assume a human nature, to identify with this nature as being God's very own, as an extension of God's own life, and an expression of God's own being. To become incarnate is for God to give God's self to that what is not God. It is a decision to be a God with others. And this is what I take the whole biblical narrative to be driving at. God is not just the creator, the one who calls that what is not God into being, but God is the one who commits to this creation, who sees it through, who is creation's eschatological consummator. The insight of supralapsarian Christology is that this commitment is embedded in the ultimate act of divine self-giving, the decision to be incarnate, the decision to be Jesus Christ. Everything else is subsequently called into being for him. Now, to become Jesus Christ, that is, to assume a human nature and to become incarnate, means, however, to become a particular human being. And as I noted above, my assumption is that to be a particular human being means to have a family, to be part of a tribe, an ethnicity, a nation, to be rooted in a history, to be located in a place. And for the incarnating God, that family is Abraham's family. This tribe, this ethnicity, this nation, they are the people of Israel. The history in which the incarnate one is rooted and the place where he is located are the history and the land of this people. But that implies election. This family, this people, is elected for the sake of incarnation. To put it differently, incarnation itself is a form of election. God can take any human nature as God's own. But since taking on the human nature is not taking on an imaginary generic humanity, but a particular human nature, to decide to become incarnate results in the predestination of a particular human nature as being God's own. But then, because abstract human nature does not exist, because a particular human nature is located somewhere, this election of this particular human nature does not limit itself just to it, but it is woven into, it means also the election of the particular context, the particular location of space and time, the particular family and relationships. To elect this human nature is therefore to elect a people. So from this point of view, let's turn briefly to the three questions, the answers of which I said would lead to a particular post-supersessionist account of the biblical narrative. I believe you should deal with these questions in this way. Election is intrinsic to God's very way of engaging that what is not God. The first object of election is God's self. God determines God's self to being with God's creation forever. And God then elects the particular human kind of existence through which God fully gives God's self to that what is not God, the human nature of Christ. And God then elects the first recipients of this gift of divine self-giving, Abraham's family. That's why there is election. If God were just to determine God's self to a general attitude of well-being of creation, there would be no need for an act of election. God could just determine to create, uphold, bless all that is not God. But in determining to become this close to creation, that is, in an act of divine self-giving, God commits to the kind of particularity that expresses itself necessarily in election. And so this then leads to a particular understanding of the goal of election. Israel is elected to be the recipients of this act of divine self-giving, to be God's family and friends. But third, the very covenantal promises that God makes to Abraham's family entail that this gift will not just be limited to Israel, that through God's gift of being with Israel, somehow all the nations will be blessed. The promises, as I read them, themselves do not specify how this will happen. The prophets and later Jewish voices give different and sometimes conflicting accounts of this. What strikes me as the most fitting the argument that I have set out so far is the unique account given by the Jewish voice of Paul in Galatians and Ephesians. The Gentiles are included in the blessing of Abraham by being incorporated into the covenant, by being made adopted children of Abraham, to be given to be fellow citizens of the household of God, and thereby fellow recipients of the gift of divine being, as given in the incarnation. Now, in being invited to set out this approach to doing post-supersessionist theology for today, I believe I wasn't just asked for the sake of the account I just laid out, but also implicitly to give an argument why I think this approach might be better to another one, with which I have a friendly rivalry, Kendall's one in his book Irrevocable. So let me summarize what I take to be Kendall's account and then contrast it with mine. For Kendall, the reason that there is election rather than not is simply a matter of divine love, of divine grace or charity. This electing love actually called Israel into existence. That is, it is not that God looked upon all the nations, found among them one called Israel, and fell in love, but, quote, the people named Israel come into existence because the Lord first called Abraham and Sarai by name and made a promise to them, which he then subsequently fulfilled, end of quote. As such, Kendall claims, Israel is unique among the nations, because only Israel was called into existence in this way. Israel's unsubstitutionary character is rooted in God's unsubstitutionary love. In being loved into existence, Kendall holds, Israel's purpose is to be something and to do something. Israel is to be, as he says, a holy people dedicated to God's service and to sanctify God's name. As such, the goal of Israel's existence is intrinsic to its unsubstitutionary relationship with the Lord. Israel is not solely an instrument in the service of a larger goal. Nevertheless, such election does not exclude the possibility that exactly as being unsubstitutionarily established by the creating love of God as God's own people, Israel can also be an instrument relative to what Kendall calls, quote, God's saving purpose for the world, end of quote, and is so, in his understanding, by being the community out of which God called for Jesus, the one in whom God dwells, and who is, quote, the person whom Christians understand to be the source and center of God's mysterious love for everyone, chosen and unchosen alike, end of quote. It is in this way that God's election of Jesus Christ, and not just, that God's election in Jesus Christ of not just Jews but also Gentiles, relate to the reason for and the goal of God's election of the Jewish people. Now, if we take a step away from this account and compare the way in which Kendall answers the three questions of post-supersessionist theology from the way my proposal did, I'd like to start by pointing out the similarities in each of our answers. First, for both accounts, God's election of Israel is the expression of God's irrevocable and unsubstitutionary love. In the essay in which I formulated my proposal originally, from which I drew for this presentation, I also emphasized the creative outworking of God's election, just like Kendall did. God does not elect Israel from a group of people previously created, but God's election of Israel leads to its creation. Second, both accounts hold to a non-functional understanding of the goal of God's election. On my account, Israel is elected to be the recipient of God's divine gift of being with. Relationships characterized by being with, they are focused simply on the enjoyment of the other's presence and company. They do not exist for the sake of a larger goal. And finally, for both accounts, Israel is created to be Jesus' family, and this becomes pivotal for the ways in which the blessing of Israel's election spills over to the nations. Now, on first glance, the difference between our accounts is also located in this last point. Because in addition to being committed to the irrevocability of Israel's election, Kendall is, I think, also committed to a continued distinct existence of the Jewish people post-incarnation. The nations are blessed through the person of Jesus, who is Israel's son. But on Kendall's account, they are not blessed by being incorporated into Abraham's family. My account, on the other hand, is committed to the irrevocability of Israel's election, but not to its existence as separate from the Gentiles. Israel's identity is distinct from Gentile identity, and that Israel's existence is rooted in election, which is not the case for Gentiles as nations. But on my account, Gentile believers do not exist distinctly from Israel, but are joined to Israel into the same covenant, which I think, by the way, is different from Christopher Wright's proposal, who replaces Israel. If I've understood Kendall's position correctly, this is a significant difference, and it strikes me as an important point of conversation within the post-supersessionist movement. But I don't think that this difference is unique to our two accounts, and thus it is not the difference on which I want to focus this afternoon. The more important difference between the two accounts is, I think, not between the answers to the three questions that shape post-supersessionist theology, but on the ways in which we use these answers to offer a corrected canonical story. A post-supersessionist canonical narrative aims to write God's election with Israel back into the story as an essential part of God's dealing with that what is not God. Kendall's narrative offers an irrevocable and non-instrumental account of Israel's election. This is the post-supersessionist gain. But here's my question. How is this election anchored into the larger story of creation, fall, incarnation, redemption? Israel, on Kendall's account, is not elected as a divine response to the fall. While Israel plays a role in God's redemption of the world, Israel is not elected for the sake of the world's redemption. The Redeemer has an intrinsic relationship with Israel, but Israel has no intrinsic relationship to the nations who are redeemed. Israel, as such, is not located in the story's chapter on election. As I noted for Kendall, Israel's creation follows, but does not precede the act of election. Israel does not yet exist when it is elected. It was not created in the way all other nations come forth out of God's act of creation. But that means that Israel in some way is created in a new act ex nihilo. And that means, and this is my concern, that on that account, Israel is still a Fremdkörper in the overall canonical narrative. It is exactly at this point, I believe, that my account has a significant advantage. Because here, Israel's election is part of the grain of the universe. The covenant with Israel cannot be superseded because it is rooted in the very being of the incarnate one himself. To narrate the story of God's history with creation is to begin with Jesus. But to begin with Jesus is to begin with Israel. Thank you.
Thank you, and Edwin, that was splendid, and grounds for future interesting conversation between the two of us.
That's the goal.
Yeah, maybe some of that can happen here today. So I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Rabbi Professor Alan Brill to the podium now as our respondent. Alan is the Cooperman Ross Endowed Chair for Jewish Christian Studies at Seton Hall University, which has, I believe, the oldest Department of Jewish Christian Relations in the country, established back in the 1950s.
1952.
1952, so good for Seton Hall.
And the first draft of Nostra Aetate, Decree on the Jews, was written at Seton Hall.
Wow. And Michael Wishegrod's papers at Seton Hall.
We have Wishegrod's papers, we have quite a few other
Yeah.
Egg Flannery's.
Yeah. So, we overcome our Seton Hall envy and proceed. Where he specializes in interfaith theology, mysticism, Kabbalah, Jewish thought, and comparative theology. Dr. Brill received his BA, MA in ordination from Yeshiva University and his PhD from the Department of Theology at Fordham. He is the author of many books, including Judaism and World Religions, Christianity, Islam, and Eastern Religions, and most recently, A Jewish Trinity, Contemporary Christian Theology Through Jewish Eyes. Alan, if you would.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to address the Society and to be a respondent to these two great papers. Now, the two papers present us with two very different approaches. One offers an intrinsic, non-instrumental view of the Jewish story in the Bible, and the other offers a creation theology of family in which the particularity of Abraham and the Jewish people is the story of Christ's incarnation as part of the intention of creation. We almost, but not totally, have a presentation of one covenant versus two covenant views of post-supersessionalism. It doesn't fit completely in those boxes, but it leans into those boxes. And so today's questions, playing them off of each other, grinding them off of each other, will in some way be fundamental. Now, before I begin, I must address that I teach in a Catholic university. My PhD is from Fordham, so I'm more familiar with Catholic theology than Protestant theology. So you have to forgive any, overlaps in the wrong direction. Now, just a little background, 25 years ago, many authors in the Catholic Church started with a dual covenant theology. Then Pope Benedict declared it must be a single covenant. And now Cardinal Casper writes that the relationship has aspects of a single covenant and aspects of a dual covenant. Now that's an important framing because rather than reaching a decision, is in terms of putting the issues on the table, that's an important way to think about it. What are the issues? And from a Jewish point of view, the most important thing that Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, left us was the fact that there are two interpretations of the biblical covenant, the New Testament and the rabbinic interpretation. And so therefore in the 2015 Gifts and Calling, that document tried to create some sort of parallelism, showing a parallel between the pre-existing Christ and the pre-existing Torah, and the Gospel or Torah are showing the same goals. The important part of that approach is that from a Jewish perspective is that Judaism is acknowledged to be rabbinic Judaism and not just the biblical Israelites. And if the goal is Jewish-Christian reconciliation through post-supersessionist theology, then the Jewish self-understanding as a living religion based on oral Torah, or as Neusner calls it, the dual Torah, is essential. Both papers present Judaism as the biblical family of Abraham. But on some level, sitting where I am, follower of rabbinic Judaism in the 21st century, if we end up with leaving it that Judaism is some prequel of the ancient Israelites, it automatically becomes supersessionalist in just the setup of the equation. Okay. And just to point out that recently a conference volume got published by Catholic University Press on Catholic theology and Jewish law, dealing with the Hermeneutic Jew and the role of Judaism within the ideas of Augustine and especially Thomas Aquinas. I think you were there at the conference and part of the volume. And, it deals with some of those issues in a different context, but no, they're being debated, and it's important to know that. Now, I'm going to deal with the papers from my Jewish perspective, and I'm going to deal with Collin Cornell's first. Now, I'm going to start with this last paragraph of his talk, and I'm going to quote it because it's particularly nice. I propose that the long particular middle of the Christian Bible, discloses God's ultimate purpose. In order to make this move, I need to disengage universal from the ultimate. I also need to reframe the Bible, not as a redemption story, but as one of ongoing blessing and creation, with redemption as a subplot. That's great. I mean, that's really, you have a redemption story, and you have the other 80% of the Bible, which is dealing with blessing and creation and the Jewish people. And he continues, God made promises of blessing to Abraham of the sheer goodness of which God blessed creation in the beginning, not in order to make him a channel or an instrument en route to the nations. God treasured Israel from out of the nations and not on behalf of the nations. When the nations joined to Israel, then a participation in Israel's vindication, not their evacuation. Great ending point. But to get there, Cornell uncovers several sources of Israel's obsolescence and then attempts to reinterpret the relevant data in ways that affirm the ongoing validity of God's covenant with the Jewish people. Cornell's very important point is that if Israel is only instrumental or a channel, then it is supersessionist. He says that very clearly and very nicely. Then is that Israel cannot be contingent and cannot be just a channel to get to someplace else. And Cornell points out that in the middle of the Bible, the drama of God and Israel, in what he calls the charter text, claim a unique belovedness for Israel, not that Israel is intermediate within God's purpose. The eschatological expansion text envisioned Gentiles joining Israel and fixing within the arc of prophetic literature whereby God vindicates the covenant people. Oh, good. Now, Cornell reminds me, and it's not his issue, how incredibly supersessionist Fun Rod is. That's really the crux in many ways of the paper, is what do we do with Fun Rod that's sitting on people's shelves? And I'll tell you that as an educator, I educate a lot of people who are in very small seminaries around the world now, whose basic book that is still sitting on the shelf is Fun Rod, rather than anything else, rather than all the stuff that we have now for going to be at the exhibit hall. But I want to point that out, that those exegesis have to be worked through. The same way we don't immediately go to Harnack anymore, nor do we go to the books that make Jesus as a non-Jew. That a lot of this stuff is less of a theology question and much more of a question, what's still sitting there on the shelf? Okay? Once again, there's actually an organization I found out that actually ships books to seminaries around the world who can't afford to keep up with the recent literature. Now, for Fun Rod, Genesis 1 to 11 is about sin. A good creation sustains damage that worsens, proceeding to fratricide, violence, and then reaching an avalanche proportions. And therefore, the major question that going to read the Bible is about sin. But from a Jewish point of view, and this is more about Fun Rod, Jews do not see the narrative about an avalanche of sin or a need for a redemption from an original avalanche of sin. There may be a fall of consciousness, but a need to then choose the right path. But that overarching, I'm just picking on Fun Rod, that overarching sense is definitely a dividing point that needs to be discussed directly to go forward. And once again, thinking back to Fun Rod, which is probably still in my basement somewhere, it remains remarkable that from a Jewish perspective, that most of the Bible, from Genesis 12 to Acts, could be relegated to being secondary status. Okay? Many of us teach Bible courses in which that would not say that that's the secondary status. Now, Cornell observes that the placement of a universal redemption at the end of the Christian Bible does not require that the conclusion constitutes the only or ultimate object of God's work. He urges the middle of the Bible discloses far more of God's will than the outer frame. For example, the tabernacle text at the heart of the Pentateuch. This elaborate mobile sanctuary exists not only to atone for sin, but basically to enable the fiery personal presence of God to keep company with Israel. But that opens the door for a comparison to the other talk, because if God is there from creation, if it's already superlapsian, then already God's presence is there in the tabernacle, and at some point those two papers should talk to each other about the role of the tabernacle. But on the other hand, coming from where I am, meaning I'm teaching a Catholic school, theologies of superlapsian Catholic theologies, like Elizabeth Johnson, and her idea of God's blessing in the world, is much more Hebraic in looking at God's role in Exodus from Egypt and clothing the naked and feeding the hungry and all sorts of things within the narrative to get there that should also be brought into the discussion. Not only the two of you, but even brought into a whole bunch of other works that are out there. That the tabernacle is not just a middle separate story, but in some ways is, going back to a Catholic reference, someone like Cardinal Casper is already a foreshadow of the incarnation itself, and therefore creation, tabernacle, incarnation. And there are bigger things that are opening that may be a way to crawl through for dealing with some of these issues. Because once again, the Jewish people are the ones with the tabernacle. Cornell goes to the charter text to point to the abyss between the supersessionist readings and the alternate readings. But when I saw the list of charter texts that were supposedly claiming supersessionalism, I was indeed shocked, because those are the Jewish texts. I thought they were there to disprove supersessionism, because the way you would read Genesis or Exodus now, you wouldn't read them in that mid-20th century point of view. So I was very surprised that you were arguing something that the idea that you'll be blessed through Abraham is already supersessionist rather than being expansive. And all the more so Exodus 19, in which if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be the treasured possession out of all people, is about, if any one of the lines that is basic Jewish theology, that the Jewish reading is exactly that the Jews keep this special covenant of Torah, Sabbath, and circumcision, and are a kingdom of priests. Once again, that mid-1950s approach to the theology of mission is really what I'm addressing more than I'm addressing Cornell's rejection of it. You're laughing at it. The question for me is really going back to these, because a lot of those readings were very strained in the way we teach Bible now. In the eschatology section of his talk, Cornell says that the charter text must serve a modulating function. He notes that the effect of the eschatological expansion is to blur the terms of God's promises made to Israel, to make other people the inheritors of Israel's covenant relationship, to the extent of transferring or expropriating their very name, Israel. Which opens up to, once again, from where I'm sitting, there's a long history of debates of who is Veris Israel, and within the church documents, that if you're going to address that point, there are really acrimonious debates of who is the true Israel that should really be looked at there. It can't just be, it was used negatively. No, we've got, entire volumes on that point that really should be looked at. Once again, on the biblical verses of Amos, Isaiah, and Zechariah, all three to my Jewish ears are universal statements of God's universal message. And I was very surprised to see the particular supersessionist versions that needed to be overcome. You can't deal with them. Amos is about, Zechariah are definitely these universalist texts. Cornell points out that this move amounts to a straightforward, the way these mid-20th century readers did it was a straightforward disinheritance. It raises Israel's obsolescence quite plainly. But from a Jewish point of view, I can't even figure out how these verses ever meant Israel's obsolescence. Just my reaction to it. To return, Cornell proposes that the long particular middle of the Christian Bible discloses God's ultimate purpose, one of ongoing blessing and creation with redemption as a subplot. God treasures Israel from out of the nations and not on behalf of the nations. When the nations join themselves to Israel, there's a participation in Israel's vindication, not their evacuation. But I return to my opening questions about Jews and Christians having two different exegetical traditions, which is an important thing to point out, even if you're now going to bring them in dialogue with each other. And the fact that theological approach that you're rejecting, to go from Genesis 12 to Acts and really downplay it, really is a difficult place to be. To now turn to Edwin Driel's paper, another fine paper. He opens up with three characteristics of any kind of post-supersessionist theology. First, it affirms the irrevocable nature of God's covenant with Israel. Two, it affirms that the covenant is expansion of a free, gracious, and undeserved election on God's part. And three, implicitly, post-supersessionist theology aims to narrate the overall story of God in such a way that God's covenantal relationship with Israel is an intrinsic part of that canonical story. And he says, for a long time, Christian traditions have told the story in such a way that the narrative jumped from creation and fall to incarnation and redemption. And post-supersessionist theologies offer narrative ways in which Israel is written back into the story as an essential part of God's relating to what is not God. All of these points are wonderful. And at that point, I can leave it at that because of defining what the goal is. But then to turn to the specific questions, why election of particular people, what is the goal, and how does it relate to Christ? Driel is known for his supralapsian understanding of creation. I actually knew him from a Modern Theology article on that recently. In the ordering of divine intentions, the incarnation is not contingent upon sin, but rather precedes the allowance for sin. Once again, to put both papers in conversation with each other, if it's now precedes the allowance for sin, does that fit into the other papers? Let's do away with Funrod's focus on the sin part, the avalanche. And both of them, going back to Edwin's paper, the Jewish position is God's plan for the universe, and his presence is in the temple, was right from the creation, and God's creation is good and intentional. Okay? And there's even, Jewish biblical interpreters that will show the same words and leitmotif are used for the opening of Genesis, the creation, and for the tabernacle, to show that it was built into the creation. Okay. But I'm already not getting, if we're starting with the creation, and the creation's good and intentional, there's not enough of God's goodness of creation, or the political saving story of Exodus, or the daily providence of a watchful God. We come very close to overwhelming that the original You're Better Than Kendall is because you have a better emphasis on redemption, but there's so much in that middle story besides just redemption for me to actually want to deal with in terms of evaluating which is the better post-supersessionist theology. Okay. Is, once again, you write, incarnation is a supralapsian, meaning by God imparts God's self to all humanity. And on this line of thought, God's desire to be imparted to humanity is logically prior to the intention to become incarnate. So once again, is it just God's self, or all the blessings of ordinary life? What is the original blessings there? To be included within creation theology, because if you're starting with supralapsian, are you creating creation theology, or is it really just focused on the redemption part within it? Also, the question is how much you're giving to pure volition of divine versus pure love, which is a dividing line between you and Kendall. And there's a lot of like scholastic arguments between is the world created from love or from volition, which may help out to formulate that better. The important part for us in our meeting today is to be a human being is to have a particular family. To be a part of a particular tribe is to have a particular ethnicity. To be a human being is to find one's roots in a place and partake in a specific history. All this flows forth out of the fact that a human being is a creature, and creatures are by definition limited and therefore sustained somewhere. If God is to be human, God therefore becomes a particular human being. Incarnation means that God becomes a particular part of a family, tribe, ethnicity. And that Israel is a tribe and family is an ethnicity. I want to point out that former Chief Rabbi, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, has a very similar approach about the role of God in the world. That the concept of a family is absolutely fundamental to Judaism. Consider the book of Genesis, the Torah's starting point. It is not primarily about theology, doctrine, dogma. It is not a polemic against idolatry. It is about families, husbands, wives, parents, children, brothers, sisters. At key moments in the Torah, God himself defines his relationship with the Israelites in terms of family. He tells Moses to say to Pharaoh in his name, "My children, my firstborn Israel." When Moses wants to explain to the Israelites why they have a duty to be holy, he answers, "You are the children of the Lord your God. And if God is our parent, then we are all brothers and sisters." And there's a lot more from that Jewish reading that could really flesh out what you want to say about Christ's incarnation as about being part of the family, because Jewish thought does go in that family direction quite often. And going back to your question of the elect, Chief Rabbi Sacks said, why is Judaism built on the model of a family? Partly to tell us that God did not choose an elite of the righteous. He chose a family. Abraham and Sarah's descendants extended through time. The family is the most powerful vehicle of continuity. Okay, those are nice parallels to think about and to work with and develop. And so far, I'm quite fine from a Jewish perspective on the role of incarnation as part of creation and the emphasis on family. Both match a Jewish thick description. In part two, when we turn when Driel says to become incarnate means to become a particular human being. For the incarnating God, this family is Abraham's family, this tribe, this ethnicity, this nation. To elect this human nature is therefore to elect the people, and God then elects the first recipients of this gift as a divine self-giving. But the way it gets phrased, formulated, is Israel in this an instrumental, or just an instrument or a channel, or having an intrinsic status here to play the papers off of each other? There are points where it does sound like it's quite instrumental rather than having an intrinsic status. The part three on Kendall, I'm not going to stick myself between the two of you. You can kind of work that out in terms of that one. But from a Jewish point of view, and I think from many Christian point of views, the more role of love may be a nicer thing, especially if we're talking about family. The role of relationships and love may be an important way to actually not play them off of each other, but to have them much more complemented. And in your account, it's committed to the irrevocable of Israel's election, but not to its existence as separate from the Gentiles. Okay? But then again, we're back to much more leaning on the foot of single covenant theory rather than two covenant theory, if that's the direction we're going in, rather than our other speaker's direction. That needs to be clarified. And then when you ask, but how is this election anchored in the larger story of creation, fall, incarnation, redemption? Israel is not elected as a divine response to the fall, but to the particular family and ethnos of an incarnate God. And that's why you think your answers up something that Kendall's does not answer up. But from my Jewish perspective, if we're going in this direction of creation, incarnation, the Jewish people, to go back to a redemption story, the Helgeschichte, in some way feels a backtrack within our conversation here, because it then all focuses once again on redemption, and that whole middle part drops out. And I'll return to my original questions, which is, yes, we've got to undo the mid-20th century theological legacy. But more importantly, that Judaism, if it ended in the Bible, then any theology, or even if you leave it in the intertestamental period, then any theology remains supersessionist. Where does contemporary Judaism fit in? Is there an automatic assumption of Augustine's or hermeneutical Jew that is already in a very different place than any actual Jew that doesn't fit into that model? In the Catholic document from 2015, Gifts and the Calling, to return to that, the church document acknowledged that Torah still has efficacy in spiritual life, and the document seems to imply that the Holy Spirit is working through the Torah study. And then it actually quotes a piece of rabbinic literature at that point. Perhaps that document suggests that the mitzvot of Jews are irrevocable, unlike the Augustinian approach. And perhaps, as it implies later in the document, it's because the Spirit has not closed within the Jewish religious history. So I turn to you with these questions. Maybe you'll be illuminated by the Holy Spirit in them, and to work forward on your comparisons and to come up with answers. And I thank you.
All right, well, let's see, can you pass over that mic here? Do you? I think it's often customary at this point to ask the panelists to talk to each other, but you all have been listening to us for a long time. So my inclination is to cut that a little short, although not to exclude it. And unless people feel a really burning need to address each other. I mean, Edwin and I will probably do that in the course of the next 30 minutes. We don't necessarily need to start there. So let me open the floor and just invite questions. Jen?
Yeah.
And I should have had our steering committee members introduce themselves and the places where they teach, but Jen, if you would just.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm Jen Rossner. I teach at a number of places, including Fuller Seminary, and I'm just thrilled. I think this is such an excellent panel, and I'm very excited. So thank you to our presenters. I have a question for Collin and a question for Edwin, so I hope that's okay to double dip a little bit. Collin, in your discussion about this sort of framing text in a biblical theology of mission, you mentioned Revelation 7, but you began in verse 9, and so I'm curious because you didn't cite specific scholars. I think you're more sort of speaking about the general way that Revelation 7 functions. But I'm curious if you can comment at all on what, if anything, those biblical theology of mission scholars do with the immediately preceding verses in Revelation 9, which is, of course, about the 145,000. So I don't know if that makes sense. That's just immediately what popped into my head. And then I'll just get out both my questions, and then if you both want to respond. Edwin, I'm very excited about your work on supralapsarian Christology, and I'm curious if you can comment on implications in terms of atonement theology, because from my read, it would be challenging to end up with some kind of limited atonement given a supralapsarian Christology. I don't know if that connects in your brain the same way it does in mine, but I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I'll start. Thanks for the question, Jen. And I might do a little, a bit of a double dip myself, and maybe engage slightly with Dr. Brill's good comments, because a lot of what I was trying to do in summarizing current biblical theology of mission is, in fact, as Dr. Brill observed, a kind of restatement and rehash of mid 20th century biblical theology. And part of what I sought to do in the book is actually to draw out the fact that very recently published works continue to reiterate all the same stuff from the mid 20th century. So Finrod is not just on our shelves, but still quoted. I mean, the reason I leaned into the language of avalanche of sin is because that is still peppered through works published this year in this area. So that legacy is still very much with us. As far as the interpretation of the book of Revelation, it is, Revelation at large, like I said, remains a really integral, really guiding hermeneutical coordinate for a lot of biblical theology of mission. Revelation writ large, even the final 2 chapters. But that vision of all the nations really exerts a massive influence. There's many organizations to this day that are named, all nations or every tribe and tongue. This kind of language really is still, again, very, very current. Not so much the 144,000. So the specific, more delineated parameters of God's people really does, in a lot of ways, it's present in Revelation, but drops out. You're not going to find that given the same priority in the sort of works that I have cited. So it's not really an answer, except just to say you're right to point it out. It is missing, and that's because it doesn't fit with making all nations really the ultimate goal of God's purpose in restoring creation.
When it comes to supralapsarian Christology and atonement, so supralapsarian Christology is, as it were, a family name, the same way that infralapsarian Christology is a family name, right? Infralapsarian Christology is saying the incarnation is contingent upon sin, but there are many different theories about why God, through becoming incarnate, takes care of the sin problem. And in the same way, when it comes to supralapsarian Christology, there are many different ways of arguing for this position. My attitude in general has been, I have a view on the incarnation to sell to you, and you can combine it with any atonement theory that you wish to combine it with, as long as you buy the right understanding of why there is incarnation. I saw a book last year published by a reformed, / evangelical theologian whose argument was, I'm a supralapsarian theologian. I'm a theologian and supralapsarian Christology kind of theologian, and that fits very well together with a penal substitution doctrine of the atonement. Well, I can see how in his circles that would be an important argument to make. Now, of course, you can ask if you take a particular kind of understanding of supralapsarian Christology, right? A particular take on what is the argument of God for God to become incarnate. Like, does that have an influence for the particular way in God might take care of the sin problem? So, in my case, I argue that it is about being with. Right? God wants to creates us for the sake of this intimacy, for the sake of friendship and family relationship. And so I take sin in a way to be our rejection of that. When God comes too close for our taste. And so we push him away, so much so that in the end we kill him. And the way that I unpack atonement theory in the latest book is to say, and God's response to that is, I'm going to be with you nonetheless. And Easter morning shows that you cannot push God out. God is here to stay. So I do not unpack it in terms of the cross is God's, taking on our punishment or anything like this. It is not that the cross is something that God needs. The cross is something we do when God comes in this way to us. And God's response is to stick exactly to the original plan, to the original intentions, to stay with us. And that is the thing that overcomes the sin problem. But that's a particular take on this story.
If I could add. So now I am going to take the opportunity to connect a little bit. So Edwin's emphasized again the idea that proximity, God's first intention is proximity in Christ, and a family forms around that. And I'm happy with using the image of a family. And all I would observe is that families have a very complex texture that includes different kinds of relations. So blood relations is part of a family, but families don't start out with blood relations. They start out with non-blood relations, and those non-blood relations remain foundational. And so simply to say family, it gets us a certain distance, but my questions kind of are, all right, what next? What does family look like? Does everybody become consanguineous, if that's the proper pronunciation, which is probably not? We know that doesn't go in good directions. So it would just be to flesh out and pull out the texture of family. My own sense is that the distinction of the characteristic of this family includes it has the elect and the non-elect.
So you told me you don't want to get into the argument. So let me just say this. I find it interesting that you go to the family metaphor. I think I would go to the adoption metaphor, because I think that's the metaphor I see Paul using, which makes the same point as that you say families are what was it the word you used, complex, right? And adoption speaks also to the open-ended of the family structure, right? There is new people, in the same as marriage, right? New people coming in. The question is then, what is the nature of the new family that is being constituted, and how do we talk about that? I think that goes to the heart of the conversation.
Yes, sir.
Jim Brennan, Pittsburgh School of Theology. My question might ask Dr. Brill, because I've read your book. Thank you for Jewish Trinity.
Yeah.
And it might relate to the others as well. So if you were able to bracket out what you called 1950s theology of the text, why couldn't we bracket out 1700 years from Constantine on as to how Jesus was interpreted as a divine person, as it was arbitrarily decided by the Roman Empire, when 300 years before that there was much more flexibility. As we know, the James Church lasted a long time, that kind of thing. So my question is to Dr. Brill, in this sense too, is if we perhaps it's time for Christianity as it's been presented to convert to early Judaism, if the third part of the Trinity could be articulated as it is sometimes during that first 300 years. And then the whole question of supersessionism would be, in other words, let Christianity be the prodigal child and not the end result of what needs to happen, and even in incarnational terms. I think of Spinoza and others who had ideas of incarnation that included nature in ways that we don't even talk about, but I do think is in early Judaism as well.
Okay.
So, I don't know if...
No, I'll answer your question. You're not the first one to ask me that. So thank you for reading the book so quickly. And what?
You sent me an earlier version.
Okay. So the important thing is that where I'm sitting, coming from a very Catholic, speaking to Anglican, Lutheran direction, I'm starting already post-creeds. I am not speaking pre-creeds. I am not speaking to Anabaptists and others. That would be a whole separate book, okay? And I acknowledge that, but where I'm sitting, I was starting with, I took doctoral comps on Ronner and Moltmann and Bard and other things. I'm starting at that point, and I had to get this message across. 2 is the Holy Spirit got edited out of the book because my publisher, God bless Fortress, said you make a sharp argument and you want it concise. You don't deal with everything. But know that if I'm giving an invited lecture at this point, the first thing I will deal with is the Holy Spirit. But the important part already, I know what I want to say. There's a difference between Holy Spirit in our lives and as a separate incarnational force versus part of a specific creedal trinity. I think that really probably does answer your question. The third part is I don't think we're not going to go back anywhere. We're not going to speak late Middle Platonism, Stoic, late antiquity. We're not going to speak the Middle Ages. If we're going to do this, we're going to have to do it from some sort of 21st century perspective, in which we probably will have convergences in our formulations, the same way the role of the family in Chief Rabbi Sacks and contemporary Christian theology has, because the role of the family, we're using the same tools to understand us looking at the family. And the family is not the Roman paterfamiliar. It's now what we think is a loving bond, raising children and adoption and all. And that's the metaphor we're all using, and that's really a good place that could start a conversation.
Edwin, and then Susanna, did you mention?
I think if you go to what probably is the earliest written document of the New Testament, the letter to the Philippians, it already has the highest Christology you can get. To him is given the name that is above every name. And as Kendall would point out, that name is the name of Israel's God. This Jesus has the name that's above every name. You can't get any higher Christology than that. So I don't think you can go, you can go back far beyond the creeds. This is the furthest you can get, and you can, to my mind, you get already that what the creeds are trying to say. So I don't think it helps to go any further.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, just for what it's worth. Susanna, and then we'll go to Bill.
Introduce yourself.
Susanna Tichar from King's College London. My question is also for Dr. Brill, if I may. Sorry. I'm really intrigued with two things that you said, and the combination between them. One, this distinction you draw between actual Jews living Judaism today and biblical Israel. And then on the other hand, you draw attention to the fact that there are two exegetical traditions that come out of these texts. One might say there are more exegetical traditions than that even. And I'm really interested how these two things might invite a different kind of post-supersessionism than either of these two papers. There's a sort of interesting slant at which your response comes to both of them. I'm hearing you saying that you're finding the biblical Israel talked about, but you're not hearing much actual address to living Jews, the rabbinic tradition that follows biblical Israel. What might post-supersessionism look like if it were to engage with other exegetical traditions and living Judaism today?
So there are many people who are doing things like, I like Dan's book on Pirkei Avot, on the ethics of the fathers. It's comparative theology work, incorporate, what? Yeah. Well, I said something wrong now. It does very nice work on, giving a Christian commentary on a rabbinic text. There is recent Catholic theologies that are now taking more account of the rabbinic tradition. There are, started from whatever point you want to start it from, but understand that, wherever you are, there's a certain point of continuance of the, if the Jewish people continued, yes, they continued, and there's using, rabbinics and into today, start at any point you want. The point is already the Protestant theologian Robert Jensen already mentions there's a need for Protestant theology to start looking at the Talmud if we're really going to engage with Judaism as a living religion. He said it only in a few paragraphs and nobody picked it up. Something that tracks me when I see it, but that's a direction too.
Who said that quote that you just mentioned?
Robert Jensen.
All right, thank you.
Anyone remember the name of the book for him?
Jews and Christians, People of God. It's
Thank you.
toward a theology of Judaism, I think. Collin or Edwin, do you want to address that? William, Kendall? I'm sorry, did I cut you off? I didn't see you jumping at it.
I'll be just really brief. I suppose this is kind of an answer to several of the recent questions. Just, I suppose with Dr. Brill, I think Protestants, I speak for myself, need to take responsibility for our exegetical legacy. So I'm not bracketing anything. I'm in a pitched exegetical set of battles myself with that legacy, because that's the only way to sort of overcome is to write against and to exegetically contend, not just to sort of introduce a new interpretation, but rather to show the inadequacies of what has preceded us from the mid-century period. And then, again, from my vantage, the way that I'm trying to honor and recognize the significance, the ongoing life of Jewish people, not just biblical Israel frozen in amber in the Iron Age or whatever, myself, is exegetically to engage very much with contemporary and historic Jewish readers as I am developing a sort of counter-proposal to all that mass of post-1950s Protestant biblical theology. So, for example, this book I've described as an experiment in a Song of Songs missiology, because and that's very much in response to Ellen Bernstein's book about the Song of Songs, Holy Ecology, to John Levinson's work on the song in his book on the love of God. And so really responding to their interpretations as a way of recognizing the spiritual life and insight that they, as practicing modern-day Jewish people, bring.
Great, thank you, Collin. William Campbell.
Thank you for Lou Campbell, University of Basel. Thank you for 3 super papers. I came out of loyalty to the supersessionist group, but I got much more than I anticipated. 3 super papers, and related well to each other. And I'm not going to get involved deeply in the conversation because I'm not up to date in many of the things you say. But the one thing I think I am up to date in is Israel, particularly Israel and Romans. And Paul has given us 3 long chapters on Israel and a long prologue to those 3 chapters. And then the people of Jesus Christ, the Gentiles, as an incorporate people, once he has established his argument that Israel is still in God's purpose and remains at the center of God's purpose. So what I would like to say is that from my work on Paul and Romans in particular, Israel is not an idea. Israel is a people. And the historical people have a history, and that history has a beginning, a middle, and eventually an end. But it is still going. And so when I looked at the way people use the idea of Israel, because that's what it has become, an idea or a symbol, but if it's an historic people, it has a social history. So you can't say that the history of Israel stopped with the golden calf incident or something else. The history of Israel doesn't stop. The history of the people doesn't stop. And a people that has some relationship to Jesus Christ, whatever that may be, that if you take away the history of Israel, you take something away, you take the basis of your thought of Christ with you. And so in that sense, Israel is fundamental to the Christian story. And I think that as I look at the talk and my thinking about it today, I kept coming back to F.C. Bauer. And Bauer has this idea, Hegelian idea, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But what's crucial and what's terrible about Bauer's synthesis, that the synthesis finishes what produced the synthesis. So if you get a synthesis, that synthesis takes over, and the past before it has gone. And he fit Israel into that pattern. And so Israel has to go when it's fulfilled in the New Testament. And behind much of our thinking is our suppositions that are unspoken, that somehow fulfillment means the end of something, whereas fulfillment, in my thinking, means Israel continues, and the same as we apply it to the New Testament. Thank you very much for our great session.
Thank you, William. So I'm not seeing hands up. Do our presenters want to pose questions to each other?
I do think you put your finger on something that Collin and I discussed 2 weeks ago, and that has to do with the ultimacy or the goal, or however you want to define it, of history, right? I mean, I think you asked about the relationship between tabernacle and incarnation, and I think you're exactly right. That if the story is the way that I put it, the story begins with God's intention to become incarnate, right? And that works itself then out in the exactly the concrete, embodied, way in which it was just being described, in starting with this people. That then the tabernacle itself, to my mind, points towards, right? That the tabernacle is the place where God is present. It's a different kind of presence than incarnation, I think. But it's exactly already an expression that is the goal of this kind of relationship. And so I think Collin and my conversation is about, so how do you think about the relationship between those two? Since in your book, Collin, you talk about these as two goals of creation. On my reading, you can't have two goals. The story starts, is there for the sake of incarnation, and so that's the goal. And the tabernacle is pointing towards and finds its meaning in exactly going towards in that direction. And so, just to say that you're putting your finger on an important point, and that is an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, I was grateful that you raised the creation, tabernacle, incarnation trajectory, given that's very much at the heart of my book. It's a lot to do with the tabernacle, and discerning how Jewish and also Christian traditions have read the dynamics from the Song of Songs in terms of the tabernacle, to see that there's deep theological resonances between those two texts, in that both have at their heart mutuality, presence, enjoyment, rather than troubleshooting, problem solving, overcoming, mending the breach, and so on. But Dr. Van Driel is right that perhaps the most adventurous piece of the book's argument has to do with claiming the dual ultimacies in terms of the two testaments of the Christian Bible. That, for me, the heart of Torah, just literarily, plainly, is the tabernacle. That the tabernacle is the culmination of creation. And so likewise in the New Testament, the incarnation is sort of the center of gravity and the epicenter of the theological orbit. How to think through that claim, which is literary, but also has some theological implications, is tricky business. On the one hand, the tabernacle precedes deeply, obviously, multi-generationally, the incarnation. But also, as Dr. Van Driel is alluding to, there's a rich Christian history of understanding how the divine movement that we read in both of those events, literarily, is in some way convergent or even identical. And that's the divine constancy, God's movement towards Israel, God's movement towards creatures, to which the tabernacle, it celebrates, it witnesses, and also God's movement towards creatures and also towards Israel in Jesus Christ, that these are not just sort of distinct episodes, discrete moments in a chronological line, but somehow converge. But how exactly to work that out is difficult for me. And so I affirm Dr. Van Driel's sense that I for sure need to have further work to do. I'm grateful for the stimulus to do that.
Joe Mangino.
Joe Mangino with College Toronto. 3 terrific papers. I loved it. I learned a lot. A question for Collin. I like what you're doing with the tabernacle, but I wonder, how does the temple complicate that? Because a lot of that middle section of the Bible that you care about is temple, not just tabernacle. And I wonder, in a larger sense, whether pro-creation or anti-Israel obsolescence theologies may be tempted toward a certain romanticization of creation and abstracting it from the mess that creation has become, which the temple exemplifies in its complicated history.
Yeah, wonderful question. Thank you. I think part of my emphasis on the centrality of the tabernacle, especially in relation to the temple, comes out of really what's come to be known as the Amsterdam School of Theology. There's some Amsterdammers here amongst us, so I'm looking their way. That sees really that there remains a sort of preeminence of Torah within the canon. And that one can argue, and has been argued, that preeminence remains, even in the Gospels, that our Lord says, beginning with Moses, and explains things to the disciples on the Emmaus Road and so on, not just because it's chronologically first, but because there's something hermeneutically at stake there, beginning with Moses. So that's part of the argument, I think, with the sort of tabernacle versus the temple, is that if the Pentateuch somehow has a sort of more gravity or more decisiveness for our theologizing versus the former prophets, latter prophets. So that could be part of the answer. And the romanticization concern is one that I have run into in every context where I've addressed this sort of multilinear nature of Scripture. And I would answer it preliminarily just by saying, I hope that by situating redemption as a subplot, rather than the kind of main plot of the whole Bible, Christian Bible, it's not to diminish the ferocity, the power, the tenacity of sin and evil in the world, but it is to understand that as kind of braided into a larger ongoing history of creation. So how to hold together the tragedy, which is real in Genesis and elsewhere in the whole Pentateuch and the whole Bible, but also to sort of see that the creation project is paradoxically deepened and intensified even through the events of judgment and cataclysm and suffering. That's hard to do, but that's what I want to try to do. So yeah, thanks for that.
Aquinas even said something about that. Grace does not overcome nature, but perfects it.
Yeah.
All right, so Aquinas gets the last word again. Join me in showing appreciation for our panel. That concludes our 8th session. I hope to see you again next year.